I am Marcus Ellison, 70 years old, and I am still learning how to live with the fact that my own son looked me in the eye on my birthday and decided I was already dead. I built Ellison Steel from a rusted warehouse and 3 second-hand welding machines into one of the largest independent steel fabrication and structural materials companies on the East Coast. I gave my family everything. Last month, on the night I turned 70, I called my son for a quiet dinner. He told me he was trapped in an emergency meeting with the Port Authority. Between sips of solitary bourbon at the city's most exclusive steakhouse, I looked across the dining room and saw him. He was laughing, toasting champagne with his wife and her mother. They thought I was just a tired old man waiting for the end. I walked over and snapped his corporate black card in half right on their table. That same night, I locked every control I still held, accelerated every personal guarantee he had carelessly signed, and set in motion a plan that would leave them personally exposed to $22 million in immediate liability. Before I continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to become the villain in your own family story just to protect what you built. The phone sat heavy in my hand at 6:07 p.m. on a Tuesday. Not just any Tuesday, my 70th birthday. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office at Ellison Steel headquarters, the river carried barges loaded with the same kind of beams and plates my company had fabricated for 3 decades. I dialed my son Ryan, 37 years old, Chief Operating Officer, the only blood I had left after my wife died 6 years earlier. He answered on the 5th ring. I could hear the deliberate shuffle of papers, the soft clack of a keyboard being typed just hard enough to sound busy. "Dad?" "I know it's late," I said, keeping my voice light, "but I was thinking we could go to the Forge on 5th, dry-aged ribeye, maybe that bottle of scotch you've been saving. It's my 70th. A long, theatrical sigh came through the line, the kind a man uses when he wants you to feel guilty for asking. "Dad, I'm buried. The Port Authority just flagged a shipment of high-tensile beams for the new waterfront project. If I don't get the certification sorted tonight, we lose the entire phase and the bonding. I'm going to be stuck in the fabrication yard with inspectors until at least midnight. I can't leave." I leaned back in the worn leather chair. A quiet ache settled under my ribs, but pride still flickered, stubborn and stupid. I had slept on concrete floors and eaten cold canned food for years, so my son would never know what real hunger felt like. If he was working late to protect the company, I told myself, I could not fault him. I understand. Business first. Keep those beams moving. Don't burn yourself out. We'll do it next week. "Thanks, Dad. You're the best. Happy birthday." The line went dead. I sat in the silence for a long time. 70 years. You expect noise, family, some small proof that the decades of missed birthdays and late nights had been worth it. Instead, I had the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant clang of metal from the yards below. I decided I was not going to eat reheated soup on the night I turned 70. I put on my overcoat, took the private elevator down, and drove myself. As the city lights slid past the windows, old memories rose like smoke. The winter of 1989, when the bank almost took the warehouse, sleeping in the cab of a borrowed flatbed because I could not afford both diesel and rent, washing my face in a gas station sink before walking into loan offices with hands still black from grinding steel, missing Ryan's Little League games, his high school graduation, the quiet nights my wife waited up alone. I had told myself the sacrifice was temporary, that one day the company would free us. Instead, it had become the only language my son and I still spoke. The valet at the Forge took my keys with a respectful nod. Everyone knew my name here. I had closed more structural contracts over their dry-aged steaks than I could count. The maitre d' approached with a warm, professional smile. "Mr. Ellison, happy birthday, sir. Will you be joining the rest of your party?" I stopped. "My party?" "Yes, sir. Your son arrived nearly an hour ago with his guests. We seated them at the center booth as he requested." Something cold and heavy dropped through my chest. I did not ask to be led. I simply nodded and walked. I heard Ryan's laugh before I saw him, loud, loose, the sound of a man who believed the night belonged to him. I stopped behind a wide marble column and looked. My son was not buried under port certifications. He was sitting in a deep leather booth in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, looking more relaxed than I had seen him in years. Beside him sat his wife, Chloe, leaning against his shoulder, a crystal flute of champagne in her manicured hand. Across from them sat Diane, his wife's mother, a woman who had never held a real job, yet spoke about money as if it were a birthright. 3 towering seafood platters dominated the white tablecloth. Oysters, lobster tails, king crab legs cracked open like trophies. 2 open bottles of vintage champagne sat in silver buckets. I watched Diane meticulously extract meat from a lobster claw. From the day Ryan married Chloe, Diane had treated Ellison Steel like a private endowment. Soft, smiling comments about how a real father would have already bought his son a larger house on the water or funded her yearly trips to Italy. I had always swallowed the irritation for the sake of peace. Chloe's face in that moment was different from the respectful daughter-in-law she presented to me. Her eyes were sharp, assessing, almost bored. I stood in the shadows, paralyzed by the scale of the lie. My son had seen my name light up his phone on my 70th birthday and chose champagne with his mother-in-law over honesty. "Ryan, you truly spoil us," Diane said, her voice cutting through the soft jazz. "This place is perfect, and on a Tuesday no less." "Only the best for my girls," Ryan replied, raising his glass. "We deserved a night off. The yard has been a war zone." Chloe laughed softly. "Are you sure your father won't notice you slipped away? You know how obsessive he gets about his schedules and his reports." Ryan scoffed and rolled his eyes. "Please, Dad's a clueless old man these days. He's so focused on his golf handicap and his retirement plans that he has no idea what actually happens in the company anymore. He swallowed the Port Authority story without a second thought. He's completely out of the loop." The 3 of them laughed. The sound hit harder than any physical blow I had ever taken. The hollow ache in my chest vanished, replaced with something cold, precise, and final. I had spent 40 years dealing with corporate predators, union battles, and hostile takeovers. I knew what a predator looked like. I simply never expected to find 3 of them feeding on my life's work while mocking me from a center booth. I stepped out from behind the column and walked towards them. I did not rush. A man who has built an empire from scrap steel understands the power of measured steps. They remained oblivious until my shadow fell across the tablecloth. Ryan's smile froze. The champagne flute tipped, spilling golden liquid onto his cuff. Chloe's laughter died mid-breath. Diane lowered her fork, eyes widening. 10 long seconds of silence stretched between us. "Dad," Ryan finally whispered. His voice was small, stripped of every ounce of earlier confidence. "Dad, wait, it's not what it looks like. We're entertaining. Diane has a contact who might help with the waterfront bonding. Preliminary only. I was going to brief you first thing tomorrow." I looked at the table. No folders, no tablets, no certification documents, only cracked crab shells, empty lobster bodies, and the glistening remains of caviar. "Working?" I repeated softly. Chloe tried next, voice artificially sweet. "Marcus, please. We didn't want to bother you on your special day. Ryan was just handling the heavy lifting so you could relax. Why don't you sit down? Let us buy you a drink to celebrate." I ignored her completely. My eyes found the only piece of paper on the table, the itemized bill resting on a silver tray beside Diane's plate. Even from 2 feet away, the total was clear, $4,800, and sitting squarely on top of that receipt was a heavy matte black metal card, the Ellison Steel corporate card. Something deep and old tightened in my chest. Suddenly, I was not standing in a luxury steakhouse. I was 32 again, sleeping on a cot in the corner of a freezing warehouse because I could not afford both heat and the next shipment of raw steel. I remembered grinding welds until my hands bled, washing the blood off in a cold utility sink, then walking into bank after bank with a folder of rough drawings and a stubborn refusal to quit. I remember the nights I went to bed hungry, so the name Ellison would one day mean something more than a man with nothing. And now, my son was using the fruit of that hunger to buy nearly $5,000 of seafood for a woman who looked at me like an aging inconvenience while laughing about how clueless I had become. I reached out. Neither of them moved. I picked up the black metal card. It felt cold and heavy in my palm. I looked Ryan directly in the eyes and did not blink. "You should have been at the yard, son. You should have been protecting the company I built with my own hands." I applied pressure with both thumbs. The titanium resisted for a fraction of a second, then gave way with a sharp, clean crack that cut through the jazz music. I dropped the two broken halves onto Diane's plate, right beside the lobster shell. "Happy birthday to me," I said. "Pay for it yourself." I turned and walked out without another word. The drive home was a blur of river lights and dark water. My hands gripped the steering wheel until the knuckles burned, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the cold clarity settling into my bones. The adrenaline from the restaurant was already fading. What remained was pure, ruthless calculation. I pulled through the iron gates of the estate and parked in front of the dark stone house. The place had once felt like a fortress built to protect my family from the world. Tonight, it felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. I went straight to my study, closed the heavy oak door, and poured 2 fingers of bourbon I did not drink. My mind replayed every micro-expression from the table. Ryan had not simply lied. He had lied with the seamless ease of a man who had practiced the skill for years. The $5,000 dinner was not the disease, it was a symptom. The real sickness was the absolute certainty in their eyes that I no longer mattered, that the man who had built everything was already halfway to the grave and too slow to notice the knives at my back. If Ryan felt safe enough to use a high-limit corporate card for a private celebration while claiming to be buried in work, it meant the internal controls I had trusted him to maintain were already compromised. A man does not start with $5,000 in front of an audience. He starts smaller. He tests the fences. Only when he is certain the alarms are disconnected does he grow bold enough to feast in public while calling his father a clueless old man. I sat in the dark for hours, tracing the pattern backward through the last 18 months. The sudden emergency meetings with fabricators I had never approved, the quarterly expenditure reports that kept arriving late because Ryan claimed he was still consolidating the numbers for clarity, the quiet resistance whenever I asked to review the secondary bonding documents for the waterfront project, the new luxury car Chloe had somehow acquired without discussion, the quiet way Diane began speaking about the family's future as if I were already gone. I had given him the benefit of the doubt too long. Tonight, the benefit of the doubt died on a white tablecloth next to a pile of lobster shells. By the time the first gray light touched the river, I had the full shape of the plan. I did not scream. I did not confront him again. I simply began moving pieces on a board he still believed he controlled. Over the next 96 hours, I used the emergency founder protocols I had written into the company bylaws in 1997. Protocols Ryan had never bothered to read carefully because he assumed they were ceremonial. I froze every discretionary spending authority above $5,000. I transferred voting control of the holding company into an irrevocable trust that answered only to me. And then I did the quiet, irreversible thing. I accelerated the personal guarantees on 4 large equipment and bonding facilities that Ryan had signed as chief operating officer without fully understanding the acceleration clauses. Facilities that once triggered by technical defaults I was now free to allow would place $22 million of immediate personal liability squarely on his name, and through the joint accounts and co-signed assets he shared with Chloe, on hers as well. They would keep the house for a while. They would keep the cars. They would even keep their salaries for a short time. But the moment the banks called those guarantees, and the banks would call them the moment I allowed the technical defaults to surface, they would discover what it actually costs to treat a father's life's work like a personal credit line and a punch line. I am not a cruel man. I am a man who spent 40 years learning that mercy without consequence is simply permission for the next betrayal. My son and his family decided I was already halfway to the grave, too sentimental and too slow to notice the knives at my back. They were wrong. The clueless old man they laughed about is the same man who still holds the original operating agreements, the original banking resolutions, the original authority to end the game whenever he chooses, and the memory of every cold night he spent building the thing they thought they already owned. They wanted the empire without the man who bled for it. They are about to learn that the empire and the man were never separate, and some lessons can only be taught after the bill finally comes due.